Hi, so my name's Naomi Dines, and as you can see, I'm a senior lecturer in fine art from Central St Martin, so not from a museum, not a photographer. I'm an artist who trains as a sculptor, so this is very much a kind of long story told very fast about kind of effectively reinventing the wheel from a position of kind of zero knowledge and equipment and technical capacity. So Central St Martin's, or CSM, is one of 6 art schools that came together as the University of Arts London. So we don't have multidisciplinary campuses. We're all kind of arts and design colleges, and we don't have kind of technical facilities like you would in an engineering school. So hence having to kind of do things very much ourselves. So my interest in photogrammetry arises from an increasingly interdisciplinary art practice, which touches on all of these things here, which I won't go into in depth, but just to sort of say that my own work comes from a position of trying to make a kind of subjective archaeology or a reverse anthropology, so producing artifacts that feel as though they were found and leaving people to sort of decide the meanings from what they can read from the objects themselves in a form of kind of reverse kind of ontology. So one of the projects that triggered me wanting to work with photogrammetry was needing to capture these military badges that belong to my family. It has a long, long history of military service with all of the kind of difficulties that generates. So I started to sort of play around with photogrammetry from a position of complete ignorance and trying to kind of generate these digital artifacts that would take the place of the real objects so that I could then use them in my own practice. So this was one of my first attempts. And it got better as I went on and sort of taught myself how to do photogrammetry, but also then tried to engage with a lot of other disciplines. So I set up a community of practice at the art school, and we invited in people from these different disciplines: digital archaeology, parametric design, 3D additive, sort of cultural philosophy, if you like. We went also on a trip to Factum Arte in Madrid in 2015 and found out some amazing stuff about how to do it at the very, very high end of both invention and engagement with very, very important cultural artifacts. But then, of course, back to the artist's studio where you have none of that facility and you're very much operating on your own with very limited resources. So I set about trying to create for myself a set of equipment and methods and resources that would enable me to do the kind of photogrammetry that I wanted to generate very, very sort of accurate 3D models of these quite tricky objects. I sort of messed around with all sorts of junk that people donated, stuff I rescued from the cupboard at the back of the photography department where they didn't want things anymore, bought things on eBay, that sort of thing. So it began very, very grassroots, with hardly any resource at all. So you can see kind of a couple of rejected light boxes from the library, some takeaway boxes as diffusers. So very, very grassroots, basic. And the clocked the Kodak projector slide carousel being used as a turntable, very basic turntable, which was all I could get my hands on at the time. So started off with these very, very difficult things. So this is my father's naval pilot's wings, unpicked from his uniform, with all of its sort of raggedy edges. And I wanted to capture these very, very small, symmetrical, detailed, dark objects with metallic reflections. So when you're just starting out in photogrammetry, there's nothing like setting yourself a really impossible target. So through sort of just basic, bloody-mindedness and experimentation, I came up with a reliable method for doing this, which is based on a sort of rotating object and static camera, which obviously is a little bit more demanding than the standard walk-around thing, but was able to get remarkably good results pretty quickly using that old Kodak slide carousel projector as a turntable. So I worked out a kind of method that was going to help me to get what I wanted, and then went on to sort of generate the 3D model. So this is in Agisoft of these objects, so that I could then go on to use them in a variety of sort of creative applications. So importing them straight into Rhino CAD software, so that I could then start to generate objects and manipulate them for materialization in a variety of materials and scales. And also playing around with VR, this is Unity, as a viewer for kind of almost infinitely scaled objects, so that you could fly around a thing and view it in a way that you just couldn't when they were in the real. Went on to increasingly difficult things. So the bands on these cat badges are almost impossible to capture when you don't have decent equipment. So then I started experimenting with coded targets to try and aid the alignment of the band and to kind of create a reasonable model from something that was very, very difficult. So you can see there the carousel base being used as a thing. So playing around with both flat coded targets and little cubes that I was making and experimenting with camera angles. And then going on to use just sort of plastic nuts from the DIY shop to make sort of complex geometries to stick the targets on to test with different camera angles. And it solved the problem that I'm sure lots of people have encountered, that when you've got a very symmetrical object, it's very easy for the fronts and backs to get misaligned. So I went from this kind of weird back to front double wings there to some very, very good, reliable models. Very quickly with the introduction of this mad kind of nuts and bolts in the middle. So then moved on to, huge gratitude to Samantha Porter and all of the archaeologists out there who generate these amazing resources and share them with everybody. So this thing here has transformed the practices of our students who've become very interested in photogrammetry. I've been trying to convert the vector graphics that come out of Agisoft Photoscan Pro into proper CAD versions so that I can then make a variety of geometries just to fold up. And I'll show you later some more complex things. So one of the things that we do at Central St Martin's is the practices of us teachers, if you like, are used to kind of help share approaches, ideas, resources, technologies with the students. So these are both coded and uncoded targets and markers from various sources, which students are experimenting with and finding out the hard way, what does and doesn't work. So some students there occluding their object with some markers, which caused them some problems later on. But you can see the sort of shadows of the markers on there. But learning through doing is very much fundamental to our pedagogy. So they did kind of learn a huge amount from playing around with the techniques that I'd been experimenting with, plus these readily available targets and markers. So we do a lot of work collaboratively with students and staff, working across disciplines, working across academic and technical teams, and working across kind of levels of education to kind of learn how to do stuff together, much of which is shared in these kinds of blogs online. And then, of course, you do something, you reinvent the wheel, and then you find it somewhere else, either a little time later or from before. So this is a fantastic resource that our students use now, which is generated by a guy called Blue Raspberry Pi on Reddit's photogrammetry channel. And you can tap in your parameters here, and it will print out much more efficient sheets of PDF targets than you can get out of Agisoft, where, as you probably know, they spread themselves out on the paper at tiny scale. And then I started to fiddle with his JS Fiddle, because it wasn't giving me targets that I could reliably know the size of. It was giving me raster effects on the edges. So I started to mess with the code to scale the numbers so you could always read them, and to get a kind of better sort of high-resolution print out of that. So as I said, we work a lot with students in these collaborative projects. This was one of the students who was in that first experimental project we did with the targets. This is Dom Bidoff. And he went on to get really, really hooked on photogrammetry. So he captured, by means of an archive, our old printmaking studios that was about to be decommissioned. So he captured the entire studio just with walk-around photogrammetry and made this fabulous VR piece, which sometime later was the center of a curation and preservation of virtual reality conference that we had at Central St Martin's in collaboration with the Tate and all sorts of other people that you see down here. So you can check out that on the Digital Preservation Coalition. So we're very much concerned with preserving, this isn't Dom's final work, this was just a game he made to test the photogrammetry, but we're very much concerned with preserving the born digital content that our students generate, because we have loads of it coming out. We have 200 fine arts students graduating every year, and they're producing a huge amount of born digital content that we collect as a university and hold in our museums and study collections as an example for future generations of students. So this is another student who was on that first photogrammetry experiment, Thomas Allison, who works a lot with Blender, making, this comes from a photogrammetry capture of his girlfriend's arms, and then he goes on to make these kind of hyper unreal environments. So both Dom and Tom and Loyane They've continued to work with staff and help other students since graduating. So they come back and they work as interns and they work as technical assistants to help other students learn the techniques they learned through the early collaborations with staff on those projects. So this is Loiane's work, which is mostly kind of image and print-based, working with kind of gone wrong photogrammetry. So I then went on to try to develop more efficient equipment, both for myself and to share with students and staff at the college. So this is just based on some stuff that was being kind of chucked in the back of the cupboard in the photographic department. So just 2 geared tripods and a transverse arm and some various old Manfrotto tripod heads that nobody wanted anymore. And then I borrowed a motion controller from a friend who does time-lapse video and turned that into a turntable. So the great thing about this setup is for the little objects that I was trying to capture, it's very, very efficient. So you can set this thing up once and just flip the head over, play with the geared columns on the 2 tripods, and then you never have to move anything. You don't have to reset anything. It's just, 3 motions, and you've got 3 camera rings in very, very quick time. So for me, trying to capture a lot of objects, I'm not a museum, but time is precious, and sometimes when you're borrowing objects to capture, people want them back quite quickly. So to have a system that would enable me to do that reliably and rapidly was really important. So I just used a bit of maths to trick the motion controller into being a turntable, and you'll see later how I got that to sync with various things. So another thing that we do a lot at Central St Martin's is these projects that we do outside in the gallery context. So this was an event called Annihilation Event Prototype, which was at Tate Modern. So I took my portable rig up there. It was all kind of running off battery, and ended up trying to work in this environment. Trying to do photogrammetry in public is very, very challenging. Not to mention the changing lighting conditions at the Tate. So I learned a lot about what I kind of could and couldn't achieve in a situation like that, which informs some later work that you'll see. So the university has 128 of its own archives and special collections, including the Stanley Kubrick archive, some Diaghilev ballet costumes, just a remarkable array of fantastic things. So this was the collection we had at the Tate to play with using photogrammetry. But it also holds some very surprising objects. So this is a 15th century porcelain chart that for some reason has ended up in our museum and is a very prized and precious object. I'm going to apologize to you all now for the color balance in the forthcoming images, which was my first attempt at capturing something large scale. So this, which is beautifully captured here in the flat by the British Library, they wanted a 3D model of it for another exhibition event that I was part of. So I said, okay, I'll give it a go. I've tried with these tiny things. I'll try with your great big translucent parchment map. So planned and designed, the capture had to build a special adapter for, a sort of very basic digital photography turntable that we had. And then they let us in the museum just for like half a day to come and do this thing. Obviously, we weren't allowed to touch it. But we did manage to use Helicon Remote and Helicon Focus to focus stack. Obviously, it's very, very deep, a long axis thing to focus stack this thing. And surprisingly, it worked, but I think it only worked because I used the coded targets all around the edge to try and capture that very, very thin edge of parchment, and also using a combination of automatic masking in Photoscan Pro and Magic Wand to try and make sure that that edge was absolutely kind of chopped out from the background, which had too many shadows in it, but it was very hard to light because the parchment was translucent. But we got a reasonable 3D model for a first attempt at a big thing. And it did show, I don't know if you can see it, but it did start to show the detail, not just of the deflection of the parchment, but also on the left-hand side there, hopefully, looks right on my screen, you can start to see the run lines actually drawn on the map. So they were able to kind of analyze it in a way that they hadn't before in terms of, how things were drawn over other things as they went along, which for a, one camera amateur attempt was quite transformative. So they'd never had any of their objects captured with photogrammetry before. So then, of course, feeding that experimental learning back to the students. So this is an A to Z map that one of the students had drawn on as a piece of sort of process-based work, and she wanted a 3D model of that. So we used the same approach, sort of passed that knowledge on to her, and then let her get on with it with this natty tripod contraption that I'd made from an old naturalist tripod that was in the back of somebody's shed, and they sold it on eBay for 30 quid. So I got that, and it made a very, very good substitute camera crane and got right out over the object. So that was generated surprisingly good results again. So you've got the, that's the dense point cloud classes there, so very, very good capture of the surface of the A to Z, and then having to use, because the student forgot to take the background mask image, so we couldn't auto mask it, so it had to be done by hand, but luckily it was on a rectilinear support, so that saved her a lot of time chopping out the background from the turntable capture. So back to the tiny things. So obviously, as you know, reflection is really challenging, especially on metallic objects, blowing holes in your models. Obviously, I can't spray my family's precious metals and metal bars and things with texturizing spray. So I had to come up with another solution to trying to capture those shiny things. So this is a model on the right-hand side here of my mother's real father, her blood father's metal bar, which is the only thing she has left from when he was killed in the Second World War. So it's a very precious object to her. So I managed to set up a very disproportionate set of equipment to try and capture that tiny little thing. So using photographic solutions to the reflection rather than cross-polarizing and those expensive things. Oh, very, very quick whiz through. Had another go at capturing in public in this booth that we set up, synchronizing the system using Helicon remote with the turntable so that it all became one click and very automatic. Very, very fast. We won't play that video. Because the sync with those two methods of the focus stacking and the rotary capture is critical. So then I went on to build my own macro rail because they're too expensive. So I got some parts off the internet, stepper motors, and I've made a macro rail that syncs up with a little stepper motor turntable. So I've got a little miniature macro kit in my studio now, which is great to capture things like this. I went on to develop some more complex target objects, which are sort of specifically sort of tuned for the particular camera angles that I was using. And again, that worked remarkably well to get things that you can't get otherwise. And as before, there's all this stuff out there on the internet if you need to get hold of it. We were approached by Hussein Chalayan, who wanted some digital models of his garments. And they were very challenging as well, monochrome things, very difficult to capture. So I rebuilt my gallery-based booth into the photography department and ended up just with 2 cameras managing to get some quite extraordinary models, which Chalayan then went on to use to create this digitally printed garment for the Shanghai Fashion Week. Our own designers in-house are using photogrammetry quite a lot. There's a great exchange between staff, and then we also go on tour and demonstrate to other departments in other places who don't have any gear at all, adapting methods to suit their equipment and helping them to capture things from their own collections, including these rather bizarre objects from the Ilya teaching collection, a handling collection that used to go out to schools. This is my last project. I'm just going to whiz through this one. So we borrowed a 7-camera photogrammetry rig from a company, which makes a lovely noise, which is totally automated. And we used it to capture things that students might want to capture. We got a lot of fashion designers, shoe designers, etc. But then I also tried it on some of the things I'd been doing with the focus stacking, and it couldn't get anywhere close to the models I was getting with focus stack single camera, which was interesting. Oh, it's very noisy. But we also messed around with it in ways you shouldn't. So students always want their heads captured. So we had to go at that. And then just recently done a short 3-month collaboration with the same company, sponsored by Innovate UK, to see if we can find out how they can develop their rig to do more stuff. And we work with our own museum to provide the artifacts which they captured. The museum curators did their first ever photogrammetry and got these results, which is remarkable testament to the accessibility of the technology. I'm working with Dom, the student who did the VR, on a project where we're working to extend garment capture, because that's very much in demand at CSM where fashion is so high. And we're going to be presenting a paper on what we're calling haptic metrology. So we're using VR to do volumetric capture and interaction with photogrammetrically demonstrated models. So you can see there the double of the dress thing was a photogrammetric model that we've put into VR and AR to interact with. We're waiting on this funding application, so my part in this is the digital capture part for garments, working with all of these guys. And that's the end of that.
I'm afraid I chased you through that presentation. Yeah, it's up to you, Eric.
Thank you. Wow, we really are a crowd, aren't we? I want to thank the Rijksmuseum so much for organizing this great event. My name is Erik Lernestal. I'm a photographer and I represent the National Historical Museums in Stockholm, Sweden. We are the largest museum agency in the country at the moment, and we have museums like the Royal Armoury, the Swedish History Museum, the Skokloster Castle and others under our wings. But today I'm going to focus a little bit about one of the other gems in our family, the Hallwyl Museum. The Hallwyl House is located in, wow, that's an interesting color, in the center of Stockholm and was built as a winter home for the immensely rich couple Walter and Wilhelmina von Hallwyl. And it was completed in 1898. This palatial residence is now one of the city's most eccentric and intriguing museums. And behind the facade, the 40 rooms, as originally furnished by Wilhelmina herself, stands as a unique testimonial of the lifestyle and decor of the late Victorian period in Sweden. However, the museum is quite inaccessible if you are not able to walk the many stairs throughout the house. Being a preserved time capsule from the late 19th century, no modern elevator has ever been installed. So in the fall of 2017, we launched an accessibility project with the ambition to digitally lower that threshold, or at least try to. So using photogrammetry, we 3D scanned all of the first floor staterooms, 10 in total. For the task I used a simple consumer camera array. You only need a single camera for this, of course, but it speeds up the imaging capture process, and it also makes you look kind of cool using it. After performing the typical interior scan dance routine, like this, you end up with something like this in reality capture. Yes. And then I published the 3D models on Sketchfab. And as you can see up in the left corner there, we just passed 1,500 followers as a museum. That makes us, I think, the 9th most followed museum on Sketchfab. Yay! So onwards. Together with my colleagues at the museum, we used the built-in features in Sketchfab to add annotations, links to articles on Wikipedia, links to high-resolution imagery on Wikimedia Commons, to enable the visitors to immerse themselves further into the history of the house and the people who lived and worked there. We also added sound in form of the pre-existing museum audio guide. Parallel to this, we created copies of the same 3D models, and which we had annotations in Swedish, These were published privately on Sketchfab and then embedded on the museum's website together with a Swedish audio guide and an audio guide produced especially for children. Openness and accessibility are core values in our organization, and since 2013 we've had over 50,000 high-resolution images, 2D images available as high-resolution downloads through Wikimedia Commons and Europeana. They can be used and reused for free under the Creative Commons CC BY license, and it was therefore came natural to us to apply the same license to our 3D models. And as you may have figured out by now, this talk does not focus very much on presenting any new or groundbreaking research. It's more a story of what can happen when you produce decent content and setting it free online. This is a picture of our digital ecosystem, if you will, surrounding our 3D models. We have the museum up there to the left, and we have content on Wikimedia Commons in form of high-resolution images. There's a lot of different articles on Wikipedia about the museum, or artists, or the people who lived and worked there. We 3D scanned the museum, used reality capture, published on Sketchfab, linked Wikimedia Commons imagery to the models, articles from Wikipedia, and we used the image service Imager to embed imagery that we were tweaking a little bit to suit our needs. And then we also did the Swedish versions directly on the museum's webpage. And we also used SoundCloud to embed the Swedish audio guides on that side as well. But here we have a little sidetrack, which is quite interesting, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. To date, the 3D models on Sketchfab of the rooms have had over 117,000 views. And for reference, the physical museum receives around 150,000 visitors in a year. This is fantastic by our standards, but the really interesting figure is the number of times the 3D models have been downloaded, which is almost 13,000 times, which equals over 10% download rate. But where do they all end up? Almost immediately after publishing, we started to find these cases of reuse all over the internet. Here's one of my favorite. Thomas Flynn at Sketchfab downloaded all the models, simplified them, and combined them all into one scene, which gives you a much better feel for how the floor is laid out. And he also used a digitized version of the original floor plan underneath, also available as a CC BY download. Great stuff, I think. And during a Googling yourself session, you all know about those, I came across this.
Hello, I'm Wesley Gowen. I'm from the Unknown Museum the other day. So I really like introducing it for you. This museum named the Hollyway House. It was built in 1898 at Stockholm, Sweden. Let me see. Shall we dance?
Well, what the heck, right? Google some more. and learned that the museum now existed as a virtual world, virtual reality world, on something called VR Chat. More Googling, and found out that VR Chat is a social virtual reality platform with lots of user-created worlds. It is currently the largest platform of its kind, with over 4 million users. It works with both the VR headsets and on your desktop, and is available on through the online gaming platform Steam. Oh yeah, that's the VR Chat Home. I learned that this Halville VR world was created by someone whom I still only know as Tiger Chips. I managed to get in contact with said Tiger Chips and learned that the person in question had found our 3D models on Sketchfab, liked them, and saw the potential as a world on VR Chat, and just got to work. Awesome. Tiger Chips resides in northern England and wishes to remain anonymous. I, of course, respect that very much, but at the same time, it's very frustrating because I would like to give her or him proper credit. But at the same time, not knowing is kind of intriguing as well. So here's what the interface looks like when you're about to load the world in VR Chat. And this is what the world that Tiger Chips created looks like. You can see he's added, or she added proper glass surfaces and fire in the fireplaces and candles in the candle holders and so on. Yes. And here's me exploring the world in desktop mode. So you can, at the start, you can pick up one of these candles, and then all the annotations that we made in Sketchfab has been reused by Tiger Chips in the VR world. Yeah, this goes on forever. Yes, this is a short clip from a 50-minute video from YouTube that I found. It's of not me exploring the world in selfie mode. There's a woman speaking Japanese, which I do not understand, so I took the precautions to mute the sound, just in case she's using bad language or something. And these images are all from tweets posted by visitors to the VR world. We are obviously big in Japan because almost all of these tweets are in Japanese. And the VR version of the museum seems to really engage people to share and sometimes it's really crowded in there, as you can see. Here's another tweet that's kind of funny. Someone tweets that they've been there, and then people adding on, and I like those avatars sometimes. Yep. And it's just basically never stops. There's a lot of this out there, and people exploring the museum as their avatar and posting selfies on Twitter. That brings us back to this that I mentioned earlier, here, where Tiger Chips downloaded our models from Sketchfab, put it on VR Chat, I found that video of that Japanese guy with the hat on YouTube, showed it to my colleagues at the museum, and now we are exploring the possibilities of using this VR world to do our own guided tours in the museum online that Tiger Chips created. And if we get that to fly, we will have achieved outreach to a level where we literally poke ourselves in the back, which is, I've collected some links and stuff about this and some other stuff that we've done in 3D on my Twitter. And this fantastic technology here is a QR code that leads you there. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think this is a beautiful example of engaging the public. John, Emmanuel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation to be able to present our project here. I would like to introduce ourselves. My name is Mona Hess, this is John Hindmarch, and we are visiting and coming today from Bamberg, which is about halfway between Munich and Berlin. And at the University of Bamberg, we have recently launched the new Center for Heritage Conservation Studies and Technologies, Kompetenzzentrum für Denkmalwissenschaften und Denkmaltechnologien. And our group, including Max Rarik, have partnered up with the project. Firstly, I'd like to briefly talk about the Center of Competence. So in the Center of Competence, we have the heritage conservation, a more theoretical research. We have the conservation and preservation sciences, so natural analysis methods for art works and buildings. We have building research, and we have the new area, which is our area, digital technologies and heritage conservation. In German, this sounds like digitale Denkmaltechnologien, and the university administration has short-titled as DDT. So here we are presenting for you our workflows and results from a joint work with the Baroque ceiling projects in Germany, Corpus der barocken Deckenmalereien in Deutschland. It needs to be explained that there was a first corpus of the Baroque ceiling paintings that ran for about 30 years, and it mainly conducted research into the iconography and the textual descriptions of the massive amount of Baroque ceiling paintings that there are in Germany. As follow-on, there is a newly funded project by the Bavarian Science Academy that is being led by the University of Munich, Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität, by Professor Stefan Hoppe. And this again is partnering with Foto Marburg. A couple of Foto Marburg colleagues are here. Yes, and here we are. And the project, we are sort of annexed and for a specific project, but the project overall is trying to document very closely and with high-resolution digital photography the ceiling paintings and to make them available over a database that is in connection with CDOC CRM, the system, and they are specifically with WSGI to have a semantic connection and to have future research availabilities. And will be available over open access over the Build Index Marburg. We are in the first phase of this project. The total runtime of this project is 25 years. So expect us to come back in 3D edition 13 with the latest results. And in the first phase, we are concentrating on court, palaces, and residences, and they will follow aristocratic buildings, monasteries, and parish churches later on. So this is the short introduction. I will now hand over to John Hindmarch, who will tell you all about the technology we used.
Good afternoon. A lot of people. This is our first pilot project, or our first involvement with the project in Schloss Arnsdorf. Arnsdorf is a small village in southern Bavaria. The castle, the original building dates from the 14th century. The current building is 16th, 17th century. It's a private residence, so the Duke actually still lives there. A lot of the rooms are obviously inhabited, and this obviously has some issues for the project, both in capturing and then going forward and releasing material. In this particular castle, the paintings are by Melchior Steidl. I'm not an art historian, but I understand he was the most important member of the Munich school of fresco painters around 1700. He has a street named after him in the town of Arnsdorf, so it was obviously a big deal. Here is a plan, kind of interesting shape of the castle, and this room, the Kaisersaal, is the one we were concentrating on. An overhead view, you can see that shape, and front view of the beautiful, still moated castle. So our visit, as I say, it's a private residence, so there's no public access. So these beautiful paintings, this heritage, cultural heritage, is not accessible to the public, and neither is it accessible to academics who want to research the paintings, the architecture, the history. So while a lot of the corpus is deals with paintings and buildings that are open to the public, this one I think is unusual in that it is actually still a private residence. So our visit, we were there for 3 days, so really we only had maybe one full day for scanning and photographing. So we had a tour from the young Duke of the residence, art historians from LMU in Munich. This was their first access to these paintings as well, so they were very excited. Photo Marburg were documenting the paintings with some high-resolution photography, and here is my colleague Max Reich from University of Bamberg. We were primarily interested in laser scanning some of the rooms, including, so this our focus, the Kaisersaal, which means the Emperor's Hall. So it's called the Emperor's Hall because, as you can see, it's a fantastic room, and you can just about see some of the ceiling frescoes there. They are absolutely gorgeous, and it's a shame they're not more accessible. So the Kaisersaal, Emperor's Hall, is a room that was prepared specifically for the potential visit of the Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor. Unfortunately, he never actually turned up. I've been in 3 Kaisersaals, all of which were created to welcome the Emperor. None of them ever visited by the Emperor, but it's good to be prepared, I expect, if the Holy Roman Emperor chooses to drop in. So 2D versus 3D. So obviously the corpus has been going for many years and has concentrated on 2D imaging. And for very good reason, they're interested in the paintings, and for capturing paintings, 2D, good quality 2D photography is, compared to a 3D model, is almost always going to have better detail, quality, color, resolution. So why bother making 3D scans of these rooms as well? So this is a quote from the CBDD website. So these interiors are characterized by the interaction of architecture and pictorial art. So it's not just the painting, it's the architecture of the rooms and the shape of the wall or the ceiling that the frescoes are painted on. Certainly many of the frescoes, particularly the ceiling paintings that I've seen in Schloss Arnsdorf, are very three-dimensional. They have trompe-l'oeil effects which you can't really experience in simply 2D images. So here is a quick view of the model of the Kaisersaal, and you can make out, the extreme three-dimensionality of the ceiling. There's another, in the bishop's residence in Bamberg, there's another Kaisersaal, painted also by the same artist, Steidl. But in fact, when they were commissioning the painting for that Kaisersaal, they approached a slightly more famous, slightly more expensive artist from Italy at the time. And he actually turned the commission down because the ceiling was too flat. It wasn't curved enough. So the shape of the ceiling isn't kind of an obstacle the artist has to work around. It's an essential ingredient of the artwork itself. So capturing the 3D shape is obviously important for art historians to really be able to examine the paintings. And also, going back to some of the earlier themes of the conference, some of these ceilings are in various states of disrepair. Some of the rooms in this Schloss, half the ceiling, half the plaster is missing. This room has had quite a lot of restoration, but even walking around the room, there are chunks of plaster on the floor. So these ceilings are gradually very friable, and they're gradually deteriorating. So to capture a highly accurate 3D model while they're still there can help preserve, document, but also can also help restoration efforts in the future. So the 3D scanning, this is I know everyone's very familiar with photogrammetry far more than I am, but I'll quickly explain. Terrestrial laser scanner, this sends out a laser beam. It has a rapidly revolving mirror, and the scanner turns around 360 degrees. So it builds up a highly accurate point cloud. So very accurately measured individual points on the surfaces. This one can capture 500,000 points a second with a high resolution and very good accuracy. The laser only captures 3D geometry information, no color, obviously. So you can add color to one of these scans. I don't know if you can make out, there's just a DSLR camera mounted on top of the scanner. Once the scan is completed, that takes, again, it revolves, and that camera takes 7 wide-angle photos from which it stitches a panorama, which can then be projected onto the point cloud. So you can get color from the laser scan, but it's not particularly high quality. We placed simple retroreflective targets around the room. This room, I think you can see, is quite a fairly standard shape. It's just a big box, there's no furniture, so the geometry is fairly simple. Oh, there is a tower attached. But we only needed 4 scanning positions to capture this entire room. There was another room, a theatre, which had a staircase, a balcony, a stage with lots of theatrical flats on it. And that was a much smaller room, but that took more than 30 scans to actually capture because of the complex geometry. So this was a fairly simple room to scan. And the final point cloud had about 250 million points. Photogrammetry, I feel very inadequate having seen some of the work done by others today. I loved that 4-camera setup. That would have. So we were using photos provided from Foto Marburg, from colleague Jonas Rossel. using a fairly expensive, so not necessarily a consumer level camera, much better than cameras I'm used to using, with a fisheye lens. And this is my first experience of doing photogrammetry with fisheye imagery. So it has some obvious benefits. You can cover the whole area in few photographs, and because of the wide angle, you can be sure there's plenty of overlap between the images. So this room took 57 images in total. We did some photogramming with a normal rectilinear camera on a room, about half the area and half the height, and that took over 300 images. So for a room like this, it's going to be a lot more time consuming and a lot trickier to get full coverage. So using the fisheye lens did help, but then has issues later on in the process, which we'll see. So in the end, yes, we used 57 high dynamic range images for the photogrammetry model. And I'm going to ignore this because I think that should say photogrammetry as done by us. Because seeing some of the results, you know, that was a gorgeous model of other rooms. But I think, in general, laser scanning gives you great geometry and perfectly scaled geometry. So with photogrammetry, you have to add the scale in yourself. With the laser scan, we have we can make accurate measurements of the geometry to within kind of the millimeter accuracy. But the color provided by the laser scanner itself it's maybe okay for a rough visualization, but certainly it's nowhere near good enough for our purposes. The photogrammetry model, the network worked quite well. The cameras were aligned very well, but as you can see, there are some errors in the geometry. There is this straight lines are kind of bulbous and curved, which I'm assuming is an artifact of the fisheye images. So we used Agisoft's calibration with obviously the fisheye option to calibrate the images. We did try them with images previously calibrated in Camera Raw, but actually the Agisoft algorithm worked much better. So we have these two things. We have a laser scan with fantastic geometry and some beautiful textures from photography. So the idea is to combine them. I'll skip that because this is a bit clearer. So there's two separate tracks. We process the scan data, the point clouds, in Rescan Pro, which is the software that comes with the Regal scanner. We took exported the point cloud from there, meshed it using some software called Qt Sculptor, which gives you quite a lot of options in meshing the point cloud, so you can get the best quality mesh from the cloud. The final quality we used here had, I think, 27 million triangles in the mesh, which is accurate but not particularly usable. We processed that mesh in Geomagic Wrap just to repair holes, repair. So sometimes when we go from the point cloud to the mesh, some fine details are lost in the statues. Things like spears or candles, even a leg of the statue are lost in the meshing process. So you can do some repairs here. And then for the photogrammetry, the raw image data taken to the camera and exported as HDR TIFFs from Camera Raw. We used Agisoft PhotoScan to get the network, and then you can sort of skip the next phases in Agisoft. You don't need the dense point cloud or the mesh. So the key bit is, so we take the mesh in Geomagic Wrap, we identify a minimum of 3 points and take the accurate 3D coordinates from Geomagic. In Agisoft, we identify those same points in the images and then manually give those points, those markers in Agisoft, the 3D coordinates we've taken from Geomagic. Import the mesh, and it's, fingers crossed, it's perfectly aligned with the camera network, which you can then use and then carry on the process to texture the mesh in Agisoft as you would if you just processed the mesh in Agisoft itself. So going a bit slow. So if I've got time at the end, I can show you the 3D model, or if anyone finds me later in the conference, I can show you. But here you can see it's quite accurate, nice flat geometry, and nice textures. The workflow also works for objects. So this is another, on the left, another photogrammetric model. In the middle is the same object scanned with a Artex Spider structured light scanner, which again gives very good geometry, but quite poor color. And on the right is the combined model. So I don't know if you can see, the model has this quite intricate lace or tracery around the bottom. In the photogrammetric model, that didn't come out at all. That was just a solid shape. But combining the images, the photography from the photogrammetric model with the 3D scan, we combine, again, the accurate geometry and the beautiful textures. So the outputs, again, like we have the 3D model on Sketchfab. It's not public yet because there are still issues. So the idea is the data will be available on the CBDD website for use of art historians, architects, and heritage preservation people, and also available to the public, so they have access to these beautiful artworks. So the project's philosophy and the Bavarian government are all committed to open access, and I was quite surprised because like most people here, I'm a big supporter of open access and sharing cultural heritage. I thought there might be an issue, but they were, in fact, more happy to share than perhaps I was. Their initial idea was for all data to be made available under the Creative Commons license, with the commercial license. I think there are arguments to be made for releasing things with a commercial license or with a non-commercial. I kind of edge towards non-commercial, but I'm prepared to be persuaded otherwise. So again, there are issues. So for example, why the model isn't public on Sketchfab yet. It's a private residence, so the agreement has to be reached with the Duke for exactly how we can share. One thing definitely learned, this stuff should be decided before the project, rather than... There are university lawyers involved in drawing up contracts now, which is always fun. So I think the commitment is there to share, it's just details need hammering out. Also the idea of, so all the data will be accessible. What do we mean by all data? So certainly I'd like to make the raw data, so the raw scans and the raw images available so other people can make better models and repeat our process. That's a lot of data. When you start releasing raw scans and raw images, it's very easy to fill up a terabyte hard drive very quickly. So who hosts that and who shares it and how do we make that easily accessible is a question. What is all data? So we can share the raw data, the process models. We've had to output, as I say, the original mesh had 27 million triangles, which is unusable by most software, most hardware. So we've outputted a whole series of different size models. Do we make them all available to the public? And yes, how do we make these big files accessible? A lot of what I was going to say here has been made redundant by your presentation, because it's the idea we would like to make these 3D models. Yeah, what are people going to use them for? Well, we've seen. And like you, I'd be happy to see one of my 3D models. Someone could download it and put it into a first-person shooter or a game or anything. So you relinquish any kind of control over what it's used for, and some of the things you might not be entirely happy about. There are possible potential political issues. Some of the imagery in these ceilings isn't what we would call modern or politically correct. And I wouldn't want to see it misused for any reason, but these are the balances. By making data available, you have to relinquish control. So I'll finish quickly. Just one further output. This is a virtual reality model created by our colleagues at Bamberg University, Professor Schlieder, and this model by Clemens Krug. And you can see they've added light sources, so candles where the candle holders would be. And this is, created in Unreal Engine, and we use it with an HTC Vive. And we're going to be doing some experiments on spatial awareness in VR environments. So these trompe-l'oeil effects and these 3D paintings are very suitable for exploring how people perceive space in virtual reality. So that's it. Just thank you to all our project partners and Jonas Rossel at Photo Marburg for the pictures. And I think all these slides will be uploaded, so these links should be available. So thank you very much.
Can I all invite you to take a chair for any questions?
I have a question.
Okay. Just a short introduction, maybe, before we start. Just to thank you for the presentations, because it was really a pleasure. And obviously, it's all about what I was trying to make sense of it in a systematic way. I think it's all about digital curation, in a way. I mean, Naomi's talk was a little bit on trying to find maybe digital curation and how to integrate it into the artistic practice, in a way. I think you were surprised by the impact of the platform you used. I mean, putting it on Sketchfab has an impact, as we saw. So one of the main things is, of course, it's a means to an end, and of course, what's the end? What's it for? But again, it's about questions. So let's start with the first question.
John, I just wanted to know from the beginning of the project to the end, including decimating, getting it to Sketchfab, do you have a sense of the timeline? How much total time it took?
It's still ongoing. So, I mean, I couldn't show you the 3D model. So there's issues, for example, with the texturing. Again, I think maybe a problem with Agisoft and the fisheye lenses. So it's still a work in progress. It was fairly painless because I've done a lot of photogrammetry projects where you take the photos, you take them back, and you try and process them, and for some reason it doesn't work. So we have quite good hardware at the university. So in terms of processing the models, maybe 2 or 3 days to go from, to generate the photogrammetric model and the mesh and to combine them. But you could spend another week or month editing the mesh. And I'm in a process now of manually masking all of the images to try and improve the texture quality, which is going to take more time. So in terms of the timeline, not too bad. It was a reasonably simple geometry of the room, and the photogrammetry worked pretty well first time. But I could spend another 6 months tweaking it. You can always make it a little better. So
All right, no, just curious.
I hope that helps.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah, on the left.
Hi, my question is for Naomi. I'm Kirat Sumcliffe with the Victorian Albert Museum.
A little bit louder, please.
Yeah, sure. First of all, that was incredible, just from what you said, having done no photogrammetry, to what you achieved in the end. But I was wondering, other than that, because you kept, you gave examples of building your own focus stacking device, and then you've done some coding and some CAD software, which clearly there's a lot of skill there. So I was just wondering, what was your skill set when you set out on getting involved in photogrammetry, and obviously what it is now?
Zero. So I'm an artist. We always have to teach ourselves new methods in order to make every new piece of work. You know, with contemporary practice, I've never used the same technique twice in any one piece of work. So I think what excites me and my colleagues at the art school and our students is that you're kind of constantly taking things from the real world and turning them to creative purpose. And I think for me, you know, photogrammetry was so exciting because it seemed from a position of ignorance anything was possible. And I think a lot of the things that I sort of discovered through kind of digging around and researching and also trying to invent new methods, you subsequently discover are perhaps the right way of doing it, but you didn't know to start with. So it sort of confirms the whole, if you like, artistic mindset, which is you have to invent what you need because either it doesn't exist or you can't afford to get your hands on it. So for me, the real reward is bringing that technology down to the level where our students can use it, which is very exciting. So, but I do have a sort of fascination with mathematics and engineering and things like that because I trained as a sculptor. So yeah, it's a happy coincidence.
A question for Eric. Eric, when you put these models out there on Sketchfab, did you think about the potential for misuse? And does that concern you? And actually, I've got two questions. And the other question would be, how has the models being out there impacted on physical visitors to the museum, or has it had no impact at all?
I'll take the second question first then. I don't know. I don't think so. I hope it has improved the number of visitors to the physical museums. I've seen a lot of comments in combination with all these tweets that telling people to visit the museum or telling people that they have been there and you should go visit, things like that. To your first question, I say no as well. I have no concerns about the misuse. I heard a great quote once, I don't remember who said it, but there's always the chance of misuse, but the benefits are always bigger. So in case of misuse, whatever that could be, we have at least provided the bad people with good content. Does that answer to your question?
Hello, I have a sort of like a question from another kind of perspective. Have you already sort of like created guidelines and practices for long-term preservation, like for file formats and metadata?
Who's the question for?
For everybody, I guess.
Okay, I may say something. Yes, I think the standards that are implemented are somewhat still in development. There are some standards for how to deal with 3D data that are coming from engineering and really sort of assuring the quality and to somehow annotate the data set that you have with a minimum of who did the data, when, with what sensor, and how was the sensor calibration at that point in time. So there's sort of a hardware information. And then there are more standards coming up with trying to annotate and connect semantically various objects and their digital derivatives. I feel it's still ongoing. It is it has to do with the longer-term preservation. It also has to do with proprietary data formats and then standard data formats that might not be standard anymore in 50 years. I feel it's still ongoing. And of course, it's cumbersome, really, to annotate each and every one of the about 30 to 40 models of the same Kaisersaal. And so there should be some sort of an interface that makes it possible to annotate all together. And then also store it somewhere in a museum environment. I think this is something that I found over the years, that it is not easy for museums to provide a server space for the collected digital data, might it be 2D or 3D, from my point of view.
I'll just add, I think with preservation, there's two factors. There's preserving the digital data, the bits, where's it stored, and then there's the problem of accessibility and file formats, and are they going to be usable 30, 40 years in the future, 50, 100 years in the future? And there's storing, so as well as the proprietary data formats, storing everything, making it available as an ASCII file is about as good as we can do at the moment. Much bigger files, so huge amounts of data, doing it that way. But you can be a little more confident that in 30, 50 years, someone will be able to read an ASCII file as opposed to a Regal scanner proprietary data file. Sometimes I sometimes find it weird when we're talking about preservation, and we were going around an archive in Bamberg, and they're showing us, they're saying, well, we need to digitize these books to preserve them. And you're looking at a 600-year-old book that is as readable now as it was 600 years ago. And you think, well, the average usable lifetime of a digital data file is about 30 years. So it's this is definitely still work in progress, because we won't be around to make sure the data is available in 100 years' time. So will the funding, this is a 25-year project, is there funding after 25 years to keep the data? It's a difficult question.
Can I add another question? Because you are working for a university, so you are, in fact, part of an academic domain, and you are producing output, but in fact you are not publishing it, are you? How? How can I see the results of your work? I mean, the model, is it published?
Not at the moment. So this because this is in partnership with CBDD,
yeah.
They're committed to making all of their data available. Again, it's how with these terabytes of data.
Yeah.
How that's going to be made available, still not absolutely defined. The commitment is there.
Yeah, yeah.
And they have the funding to develop solutions.
Yeah.
But Sketchfab is publishing data.
Is that seen as a scientific publication?
No.
Because that's my point. How are you making your results part of an academic discourse?
I'd like to add that we are also, these are all valid questions, and we are trying to also to have our students who are studying their masters with us to really sharpen their eyes for these problems and to forward think any solutions that I might find. So a little plug for the new MSc in Digital Technologies and Heritage Conservation. There is actually a project that I am trying to win tomorrow, and need to defend it, and this is looking at the infrastructure for subjects like ours that are coined in Germany as small subjects, rare subjects, so small groups that are having diverse data in different modalities. And how is the infrastructure and the digital infrastructure going to be that we can support this, and how can we make sure that also scientific data can be accessible even before publishing? In other fields, like in life sciences, there are pre-publication data repositories. Every single experimentally collected data set has already a DOI that is citable. So it's a question whether a single 3D model can be citable as well and accessible through that. So I think it's still missing in infrastructures, but I think we're going to get there if we're heading in the direction of providing the correct infrastructure, such as, for example, life sciences do.
I think maybe one more question. Okay. Okay. Last question. Otherwise, we go for coffee or tea. And maybe. Okay.
Maybe another question to John, I think. In the presentation, I saw a few results that, in my mind, I was looking at a kind of a tomb with frescoes on the outside. Is it only my mind who tricks me, or I don't understand?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
There were pictures, the result of the Kaisersaal, and in my mind I saw a kind of a tomb with frescoes from the outside.
Yes. So that's just a default view to kind of give an impression of the 3D shape. We can obviously go inside it.
Yeah, but I didn't understand it at the point, so that's why I asked.
So it's just...
Because my mind was tricked.
I apologise. It's like looking through a transparent, yes.
Okay, so now the final question.
I guess this is for John. I was wondering about the sculpture at the end, and you were talking about how the photogrammetry was not bringing out, the small scale stuff. Why do you think that is? I mean, did you go back and say, can I do the photogrammetry better? I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, so this was, in fact, a model we created on a teaching week. So the model was created by students. This was their first experience with photogrammetry. So I think, yeah, there are ways and means, sort of the efforts you went through using extra coded targets and to being able to control the lighting better. But if you can't do that, and you have access to a nice structured light scanner, there's a way, okay, so even if the geometry I've captured with photogrammetry isn't perfect, as long as I can still make the camera network, I can still make a beautifully textured model using the scanned geometry. So yeah, as I said, in that slide, photogrammetry doesn't provide brilliant geometry. That's clearly not true. You get the amount of effort you put in, you get the results out. But I think this is a way if you don't have the equipment, the lighting, or the skills, like myself, to create a perfect photometric little model, it's a way of combining the ease of capturing geometry with scanning technology and the ease of capturing nice textures with photography.
Very short.
The reason the reason that we developed the photogrammetry approach was because we don't have any scanners. So it swings and roundabouts.